And Jennifer, I don't see the Facebook live notification where it usually pops up beside recording. Can we double check to make sure that we are live?
As it's fetching the video stream.
Okay, so it's still loading. All right.
Yeah, why don't you say hi to YouTube people while we're...
Yeah. Hello to everyone watching us on YouTube. Thank you for joining season 2 of A Valid Podcast. We are currently waiting on our Facebook Live connection, and we will get started. We have Professor Darren Whitfield here from P, and he's going to talk about intersectionality, and we're definitely looking forward to that. So thank you all for joining us. And of course, if you have any questions or comments that you want to make throughout the show, throughout the interview, you can put those in the comment section below on either the Facebook Live or YouTube, and we'll be sure to ask any questions that you may have.
Let's just go without Facebook.
Okay, so we could share the YouTube link to our Facebook page.
Yeah, we'll worry about that later. Go.
All right. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We are about to start recording A Valid Podcast. Our host, guests, and phone listeners are using Zoom. Everyone in the Zoom call is muted as they enter our live shows. When you are unmuted, please minimize movement. And of course, our audience that may be watching on the live stream can comment and ask questions throughout. And now we are recording, and if everyone's ready, we will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Nationality, gender, sexual orientation, race, and disability, like lions and tigers and bears.
Oh my, just like the Wizard of Oz.
There can be hazards for people who walk these roads in one or more minority categories in policing, healthcare, education, and more. This is A Valid Podcast. I'm Darah Thompson, and I'm joined with my sister, Alana Gibbs.
Today, we'll talk with Professor Darren Whitfield. He teaches at the University of Pittsburgh and is part of the Center on Race and Social Problems. We'll share what intersectionality means to us. We'll also hear about what the Special Olympics is, how the Special Olympics is responding to the pandemic. Welcome to the show, everyone. We'll start with reporter Nick Tomarello. Hey, Nick.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Yourself?
Hey. I'm doing well. Thanks, everyone. And we're lucky for and happy for everyone to be here at season 2 of A Valid Podcast. And of course, I would like to welcome Dr. Darren Whitfield from Pitt University. And we're going to hop right in with the questions. So, Darren, I'd like to start off by defining intersectionality. Could you explain where this term comes from?
Thank you for having me, Nick, and that's a great place to start. So the term intersectionality was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar, in 1989. So actually this last year, we celebrated 35 years of intersectionality, and she gave a wonderful talk to clear up misconceptions about it. But essentially, intersectionality is this idea that each individual holds different identities and that we all walk through life as all of those identities intersecting. And each of those identity carries a level of power, privilege, or marginalization. And that through the blending of that, we sort of interact with the social environment, but that is not without sort of power dynamic. So I think a central tenet of intersectionality that people often forget is that we live in a society with power differentials, right? At the individual, group, and societal levels. And those societal and institutional levels really influence how we experience our social environment because of things like racism or ableism or sexism. And so that it's a central component, but I think it's really important to think about how you show up in a room. Those identities really together influence the experiences that you have, and that's layered by things like structural inequalities that exist in the society.
And you studied the relationship between social media and depression among lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And your research is based on 2 points. This population is more socially active on social media than heterosexuals, and also the depression rate in this group is 1.5 to 2 times that of heterosexual counterparts. Now, people at the intersections of minorities we're discussing today are among those who are targets of abuse. Does that play into this conversation in terms of how people in what we call intersections are impacted by, say, hate speech online?
Yeah. So first, I want to say that I did that work with my colleague, Dr. Cesar Escobar. So I don't want to take credit for all of the work. I was part of a
Sure.
team who did that research. But I think absolutely right. So when we see, so there's a famous theory. It's called minority stress, which was done by Ian Myers and David Frost. But what they explain is how individuals of different minority groups and of our minority status and experience stress above and beyond the daily stressors that individuals from perhaps a privileged background might experience. And so when we think about things like the intersections of marginalized identities, right, then we would expect that those individuals would unfortunately experience more discrimination, right, or more victimization. So when we think about things like hate speech, it is not surprising that we would see things such as queer people of color or queer disabled individuals experiencing more hate speech because they belong to multiple minority categories and therefore are more impacted by that. So when we look at those things in that study, when we looked at mental health outcomes, it's not surprising, but that happens in all aspects of, unfortunately, of our society. When we look at things like healthcare, health access, and health outcomes, when we look at things like, the murder rate amongst trans Black women, those things are not surprising when we think about it from the lens of intersectionality and those interactions of who their identity really is. And so, yes, I mean, we would expect those things, and unfortunately, we don't live in an equitable society. And so, when you layer on marginalized identities, we will often, or you might expect that there um, would be additional violence, marginalization, victimization that would occur to individuals.
And why is this research important to you?
Um, that's a really interesting question. I don't know that many people ever ask me why it's important. My research is important to me. I would say that this is important to me because I identify as a marginalized individual, right? I am Black and I'm also a gay male, and I grew up in a poor community. And so for me, as someone who has now had an identity shift in terms of my socioeconomic status, it's really important to me to be able to give back and to speak to and voice the experiences of different communities in which I am a member of, to really undo what I would consider is centuries of whitewashing of the experience of people in this country.
And you actually brought up the term intersectionality that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, you said 35 years ago, which is around the same time that the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed
Mhm.
into legislation. And still, we know that the fight for civil rights continues. Can you share why intersectionality is a crucial component in the fight for civil rights?
Yes, and let's be clear about the research that Dr. Crenshaw was doing. So that research was directly related to what she was seeing in the legal system in terms of Black women having equal access to legal representation that was equitable, and seeing that there was disproportionate sentencing, that there was all this disproportionality occurring for Black women in the legal system. And so she was like, there's something here. So, I find it interesting that this was rooted in the legal system, and policy and laws, right? And what that might mean for other groups. And so I think what you are talking about is really important, because I think when we think about, we're in this moment right now around anti-racism. And I think while we can, and it's an important moment, but I want us to think really critically about what that means to be anti-racism when we think it through from an intersectional perspective, right? Because it's not just Black folks in general, right? Like Black people are not monolithic, like no group is a monolith. And so to really be true and speak true to like who makes up those groups and how might those groups have different experiences, right? My experience as someone who is a college professor is much different than the experience, and I tell this to my students all the time, right? My experience is very different than the experience of someone who is also Black and maybe gay or bisexual, but also might be living with a disability or might be living in poverty, right? And so, or an array of identities where they are experiencing inequities, right? Or they belong to a marginalized group. And so I think as we think through this moment, but also lots of moments in history as we fight for equality in this country, it's really important that we think about the intersections. One of the things I find interesting in the movements that we've had over time is I don't think we've done enough critical reflection of who's in those groups. And so people get left behind, right? When we think about the women's movement, right? And suffrage, right? There was lots of critiques about that because who was included and who wasn't. When we think about the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s and ask ourselves who was potentially left behind. And I think, speaking as a queer person of color, I think about the equal rights movements for gay and lesbian folks, and I often say like, who's not in this conversation? Like, because we are not one community. We are a collection of folks who belong to a community, but that doesn't mean that everyone is going to benefit from what cause we're fighting for, right? When we looked at the passage of same-sex marriage, right, and equal marriage and marriage rights, there were a lot of people who were very excited about that, but there were a lot of people in the community who that was not the first thing on their mind because they belonged to other marginalized groups. And so marriage was not the battle they needed to be won. They needed another battle to be won, right? They needed better access and accessibility for folks living with disabilities, right? Or they needed better protections for racial and ethnic minorities, right? They needed other things. And those were the battles that we still have not won. And so marriage equality doesn't necessarily ring to those groups.
And how can we be more mindful of intersectionality in our daily lives?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is recognizing that if we truly look at who we are as individuals, no one person experiences all marginalization and no one person experiences all privilege, right? And if we really are clear about intersectionality, I think that's one of the things that we have to be clear about this because we're an intersection of identities. And so I think to be mindful is to really examine our own identities and say, where do I have privilege as an individual? And where am I experiencing marginalization? And to ring true about that and think about the ways in which we experience privilege, that we are uplifting those folks who we have privilege over, right? And to be an ally in that way, just like we would want other people to be allies for us and our marginalized identities, right? This isn't the oppression Olympics, as I tell my students, right? We all have a little bit of both. And so all of us have work to do. We all can contribute to equality from some front because we all experience privilege in one way or another. And so it's up to us to be critical about our identities because it's so easy to be bogged down, trapped in your marginal identity and how you are oppressed, that it becomes really hard for you and for all of us, myself included, right? I have to check myself too, right? Around like, how am I experiencing privilege and what am I doing to take away from that privilege that I experience, and to provide an opportunity for people who don't experience or enjoy that same luxury to have a voice and to be heard and to be listened to.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Alana and Darah, to follow up with any questions or comments that you have for Darren.
First, Professor, I would just like to say thank you for being here today. That was powerful. It was very powerful, moving, and I just really appreciate the research that you're doing, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast today and sharing your thoughts with us. It was very powerful. Thank you.
Yes, definitely much appreciated. If you wouldn't mind sharing, as you mentioned about people fighting their battles, would you mind sharing maybe some of your experience and what battle you would like fought, or what people can fight for you?
Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about sort of the work that I need to do, because I think part of speaking to and to provide education is also to model that behavior. So I'll talk about, right. So for instance, when I was asked to be on this show, it was very clear that, like, I'm not a person living with a disability, and so my first response was, is that okay, right? Because I want to make sure that I'm always providing an opportunity for someone who doesn't always get that stage, right? Or get that platform. And so I am always conscious about, like, if I am taking up space, who am I taking up space from, right? And so is there someone better served? So, I frequently will get requests to, like, come and speak or talk about something. I always, before I agree, I think to myself, if I say yes, whose voice isn't being heard, and who do I know, and if I don't know someone that I can put people in contact with, that tells me a place where I need to do some work, right? So if I can't point to a queer person who's living with disabilities because of, the theme of this podcast, then what do I need to do, right? What work do I still need to engage in? One of the things that I tell my students and I try and practice is to look at your circle of friends, right? Because we live in bubbles. We can try and sugarcoat it, but we all live in bubbles. We hang out with people who of our like mind, right? Birds of a feather flock together. And so, what does your circle look like, and how do you expand that circle of connections to include people who you may not share perspective with because they may not be of the same privilege as yourself? And how do you have meaningful connections? I heard, and I can't remember the scholar who I heard this from, so I'm not gonna say who, but the scholar had said that civil rights are won through relationships. And I truly believe that, right? We can legislate. Oh, I know who it is now. It's Dean Spade. So Dean Spade out of the University of Seattle. So Dean Spade had said, we can legislate as much as we want, but legislation has never changed to changes in attitudes. And the change in attitudes is what is actually needed to then change the culture of a society, right? People in this moment of Black Lives Matters is like, I'm surprised. I thought we settled racism, right? Lots of people think that. Lots of people think that the civil rights movement settled it, but it didn't, because it was legislation. It wasn't a change in the country's attitudes around Black people and their place in the society, right? We find these battles all the time. Obviously, the suffrage movement did not, and the waves of feminist theory did not change the standing of women in our society. And it is because we legislated our way to rights versus changing the attitudes of a society. And that only happens when people feel like they have a connection. If I feel like I am invested in someone's life where there is discrimination occurring, I am more likely to engage in actions to undo that discrimination, right? Harvey Milk said, come out wherever you are, the LGBTQ folks. And the reason he said that was because he knew that the only way we're going to change our society is that everyone knew that there was a person in their life who discrimination against LGBTQ folks was personal. And that would change that person's ideas around discrimination, right? If everyone knew and had personal connections with people across different marginalized groups, it would change it would change attitudes, and it is a change in attitudes which will change the cultural understanding in our society and change our cultural perspective. Legislation will never be effective at actually changing the minds and hearts, which is what actually changes a society, not laws. I can't point to
Right.
one law that has actually changed the lives of marginalized people in this country in a really powerful way because they were legislated, they were fought, and all laws can be undone. We are seeing it now, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And that's the movement right there.
Yeah.
Change the hearts, change the attitudes, make a better world for everybody.
Yeah. Look at your social circle, expand it. That's a wonderful take home.
Right.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for being here again.
Yeah,
It was a pleasure, absolute pleasure.
It definitely was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll take a quick break to break down what we've experienced in our lives that makes us aware of intersectionality's importance.
I'm 5'11".
Okay, well, we're back now with Alisa Grishman, a lead analyst here on a Valid podcast where we're talking about intersectionality.
Baseball fanatic.
Alyssa, I know you were following our last segment with Darren Whitfield.
I'm a bodybuilder.
What are your takeaways from what you
I'm a
heard?
research analyst.
Small business owner.
Oh,
Teacher. Dance fitness
there's
instructor.
so much
Film
to
and television
unpack
actor.
from
I'm an office
everything he
clerk.
said,
I'm a
and
copywriter.
you
I'm a
know,
veteran.
I have a prosthetic leg.
my
have multiple
biggest
sclerosis.
I
takeaway
have
was
Cerebral palsy.
the idea
Post-traumatic stress
of,
disorder.
I'm
you
blind.
know,
And I'm
if
working in a
I
job I
don't know
love.
someone
Because I
who
was given a chance.
represents
because
a
I was given a
particular
chance
To
group
contribute
or a
my skills
particular
and
aspect of
talents.
to
society,
show my disability
it's
is only
on
one
me.
part
It
of who
behooves
I am.
me
Who I am.
to change that
work,
and
it's
to
what
meet
people can
people and
do that
include them in my
matters.
For more
social
information,
circle
visit
and
whatcanyoudo
expand that
campaign.org.
bubble. So the way he put it was so important and so necessary, and I think a great takeaway.
Right.
Yeah.
I can definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Sister,
Yes, ma'am.
what was the time you recalled that an understanding of intersectionality has been important?
Well, I think for me, having MS and having people say, oh, well, Black people don't have MS, or, this doesn't happen to this group or that group. But I feel like for us personally, we're always the ones who are out there fighting for the underdogs, trying to, make sure everybody wins. So I don't know if that's quite a thing for us.
Yeah, I would have to agree. How many people mental health for African Americans, if research says that it's harder for us to get treatment, and then when we do get treatment, sometimes we don't get the latest treatment. So yeah, being at that intersection of being Black with a mental illness, those are the voices that we need to lift up. Yeah. And it's definitely makes me want to think like, oh, who's not in my friends group? Who's not in our circle? And who do we need to bring into our circle?
Right.
Squad goals, right?
Seriously. I mean, I feel like
Squad
everybody,
goals.
it's just very interesting. I feel like everybody can be lifted up at one time or another. So
Definitely.
if you can't find somebody to lift up, you're doing it wrong.
Definitely need to expand our squad and learn from them and help them, because if we all are lifted up, it makes a better world.
We all win.
Mhm.
Amen.
Lift it up.
All right, next up, Nick Tabarello is back with the host of our sister podcast, Look Who's Here. Who's here, Nick?
Hey, thanks, Elena. Hey, Aaron, are you here with me?
Yep. No.
Hi, Aaron. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Thank you for joining us live here on A Valid Podcast. We're definitely looking forward to your interviews. And so, Aaron, we know that, of course, sports are limited during the pandemic. And
Got that right.
yeah, right. and in upcoming podcasts, you interview local directors of the Special Olympics and also Miracle League. So, Aaron, I wanted to ask you, what do you miss most about Miracle League?
One, I'm not swimming because I have to do that for Special Olympics, and I also miss golf.
Yeah, I remember you talked you swimming and you said golf for Special Olympics. And I know that Miracle League, don't you play baseball with Miracle League?
Kind of. Special Olympics is different than Miracle League. That's
Right.
for like baseball mostly.
Yeah, and I know you play baseball, but
I
you won't
play
get to for a
baseball.
while. I know, but you won't get to for a while, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think, what are you going to miss most about playing baseball?
Missing the fans and also playing with the players.
Yeah, definitely. And I know with Special Olympics, you actually took part in the summer games for Special Olympics PA. What were some of the activities that you got to do with that?
We did a virtual summer games here at the house.
Right, at your house. Yeah. And what kind of games did you play? Did you do any events?
Actually, doing putting, and I also did running.
And running, yes. Running's fun. But you had you had a little accident, right?
Rubbing.
It's okay. That's sometimes when you're having fun, you can have accidents. But I remember from the conversation that you had with the sports director for Special Olympics Allegheny that they are actually looking to do a virtual Special Olympics just like the Summer Games. They sort of want to copy it in a way and do events like that. So that should be really cool, Aaron. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your podcast coming out on Sunday. Your interview with Special Olympics Allegheny. Thanks, Aaron.
No problem. Oh, thank you. I meant.
Thank you. And of course, I would also like to highlight Unabridged Press's partnership with Public Source for the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act at adapittsburgh.com. And there you can hear the voices of people with disabilities through reported articles, first-person essays, podcasts, and video. And if you want to learn more about Alana and Darah, our two new voices to A Valid Podcast, you can listen to episode 5 of ADA at 30. And of course, we do have events going on every single week. And tomorrow, you can join Disability Pride Virtual PA 2020 for a film and panel discussion about the history of institutionalization and current home and community-based services. And if you would like any more info on that, you can visit Disability Pride Philadelphia's Facebook page.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you to Dr. Darren Whitfield of the Center of Race and Social Problems at the University of Pittsburgh for joining us, as well as our lead analyst, Alisa Grishman, and founding host of Look Who's Here, Aaron Gannon. I'm Elena Gibbs, and with my sister, Darah Thompson, this is A Valid Podcast. We just want to say, please be gentle with yourself, be kind, include people, mean people stink.
A Valid Podcast is produced by Unabridged Press and the Center and created with support from the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University. You can listen to us on Apple Podcast, Google, and Spotify every Friday morning. We hope you'll listen and leave us feedback and a rating. For more information, go to avalidpodcast.com.